Now, we're moving into quite an interesting situation where we've had new talks of new budgets, Canada, America, infrastructure, global corporate tax. And it seems like all of these topics that our guest today has discussed, the reckless policies of monetary by governments, can have some consequences. And right now, we seem to be staring down the barrel of those. And we're going to be discussing the implications of this, the effects it has on commodities and gold. And our expert here today is truly one. His name is Mr. Rick Rule. Rick's one of the most well-known, successful commodity investors in the entire world. And so make sure you hit the like button on this side right over there or this side. Send this video out to more people. Give us a comment down below that says Rick Rule Rules. Comment down below, Rick Rule Rules. We got Rick's new website, which we'll link right there down below. And just want to give a special shout out to our channel sponsor, which is Vizsla Silver. So thank you, Vizsla Silver, for being our mining stock sponsor today. And it's good to see you, Rick.
Pleasure to be with you, Jake. Thank you for having me back.
So what do you make of the environment that we're in right now? There's an incredible amount of people not paying their rent, not paying their mortgages. They can't. We've had the government pull this back out even further. We've had talks of quote unquote infrastructure, global corporate tax. What's going on, Rick?
Well, I would describe my reaction as horrid fascination. The truth is, Hayek, many years ago, 60 or 70 years ago, described the circumstance in front of us and his fear of it by saying, we always need to remember that there's a lot of ruin left in a country as great as our own. So it isn't something where I expect the end of the world next week, but one needs to be concerned. One needs to be particularly concerned if one is your age or younger. What the real impact of government debt and deficits and the debasing of the currency is about is an older generation, which is to say my generation, which has voted themselves all kinds of cool benefits, enjoying the benefits and leaving the bill with your generation. The fact that we have consumed the great output of this society and our consumption has left you all with a bill is something that were I your age, I would be concerned about and angry about. It's ironically sort of amusing to me that there seems to be overwhelming fondness among your generation for big government. I suspect that your generation is going to get what they want, good and hard, and they will enjoy it less when they understand what's in front of them. I'm reminded in the broader part of your description of a little poem that I learned when I was earlier. It goes like this: when your outgo exceeds your income, your upkeep becomes your downfall. As a society, we are spending more money than we are creating. And we are financing that by mortgaging our, or in my case, rather, your future. And this situation goes on as long as there is confidence in the system. But when confidence in the system exits, or I should say, if confidence in the system exits, then the consequences are certainly unpredictable, but almost as certainly, Jake, unpleasant. I would suspect that the calm that we're experiencing in political and financial markets is due to the fact that many people don't understand the difference between liquidity, which we have lots of, which is to say money in the system, and solvency, which is to say that we have the ability to service our debts and repay our debts, which we don't. And I suspect at some point in time in the future, perhaps sooner rather than later, we're going to confront that. How we confront it is something that I don't know.
So you mentioned Hayek. He wrote the book Road to Serfdom, right?
Yes.
How much of that do you think is playing out right now?
I think it has been an ongoing process. I think that all investors, but particularly young investors, would do themselves a service by reading both Hayek and von Mises, and probably starting actually with Hayek Light. Read Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson. It's important to understand the way the economy really works rather than the way that your university or your congressman or somebody like that believes it should work. So I would suggest that rather than starting with Hayek, who is a pretty pedantic writer, that younger people start with Economics in One Lesson by Hazlitt. And that will give people of any age that aren't familiar with it a very good grounding in what is going wrong and what one might do to ensure one's self against the outcome.
So, can I ask you, especially when you worked at Sprott, I mean, you probably kept you never said too much in an interview, but you also are more optimistic than Doug Casey is too, right? Than one of your good friends and someone I really love to talk to that you connected me with. But I can't help but to think that Doug's painted picture of the future, we seem to be moving more in that direction. When you have a country that is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, and you have an even worsening gap between the rich and the poor, you have officials talking about a global tax, which, I mean, what at that point is it just our country's just a facade and you have a one world government system? I mean, you're moving into this territory where you said as a young person you should be concerned. I just can't see how there's a bright picture in eventually, even if something bad happens, maybe something good will come on the other side. But that road to serfdom seems like a real possibility. And I want to know your thoughts on it. And then I want to know the best advice you have to not walk down the road to serfdom.
Those are big questions. So let's unpack them one at a time. The truth is, as you say, compared to Doug, I'm a hot-eyed moderate. I always like appearing on panels with Doug because he makes me seem absolutely reasonable, which I seldom am. Understand that Doug has been right with distressing regularity, and the outlook that he espouses, one would prefer him to be wrong rather than right. I am personally an incurable optimist if I get to look far enough in the future. We've discussed the reasons for this on your show, but we'll do them again. The younger generation, far from being the wastrels that is suggested by my generation, are the most empowered and educated generation that the world has ever seen. You don't even have to have access to facts anymore because Google has all of those. You don't have to have access to knowledge. You just have to have access to how to get hold of knowledge. And information isn't distributed from the top. Young people wisely don't always listen to what their government has to say. There's peer-to-peer information distribution, including a very smart young guy named Jake Ducey, all of which is very, very good. Further, for everything that's wrong with the United States, it's still a place where 5 or 6 kids can get together, commandeer a garage in Sunnyvale, California, and out pops Google, which makes $20 billion a year, consuming almost no capital in the process. All of that's good. So my optimism is founded on the fact that through individual initiative and intelligence, thus far at least, we have been able to afford our collective stupidity. Now, it is true that the weight of our collective stupidity is beginning to slow down our individual initiative. And my belief is that there is probably a reckoning due. When you discuss the debt and deficits, however, Jake, this is a correctable problem. Remember that the on-balance sheet liabilities of the US federal government are about equal with GDP. If we could restrain the growth of the on-balance sheet liabilities to a level less than our economic growth, the truth is that the government has a way out. The off-balance sheet liabilities are much more concerning, but much more correctable. The right thing to have happen is that when the younger voters outnumber the older voters, They say to us, that is, your generation says to my generation, you know all those promises you made yourself? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all these trust funds? You made the promises. You keep them. You pay for them. We're not gonna. A good old-fashioned default where the younger generation of voters says to the older generation of voters, you lied to yourself. I didn't lie to you. You keep the promise because I'm not going to. Now, this would be politically interesting in a country like the United States, where older people like myself believe, because they've made themselves the promise popularly, that they have the right to stiff your generation with the bill. But a good old-fashioned default, which is to say the renunciation of the generation that got the obligation without getting the benefit, would solve the problem very, very, very quickly, albeit there would be an awful lot of social and political chaos. My friend Doug Casey describes that process by way of saying, I really want to see this happen from far away on a broad screen TV. He doesn't want to be part of it. And I don't suspect that that's what's going to happen, actually. But the truth is, it is a very correctable circumstance if you had the political will to correct it.
Yeah, I think I'm. It sounds like, as you and I were talking off air, I'm more in Doug's camp. I'll watch it from far away on a television. Is kind of the way that I'm moving. What do you suspect will happen then?
I suspect that we'll muddle through. I suspect that, first of all, confidence will begin to subside. And I suspect there will be one or more financial events, not unlike 2008. I guess that's the good news. I suspect that your generation will begin to push back against unfunded liabilities and against debt and deficits, as your generation, which, as I say, is the most informed generation that has ever inhabited the earth, comes to understand that government, far from being their friend, is their mortal enemy. And my hope is that your generation has the courage and the sense to do what my generation didn't do. And I sort of suspect that that's what's going to happen over 20 years. It's getting from here to there that has me concerned. Given that I'm 68, 20 years, 25 years seems like a reasonable time frame of concern for me. But, I also think that when you are confronted with societal issues that are bigger than you, that your first obligation is to take care of you and yours. I'm not advocating being selfish necessarily. I'm just suggesting that if 370 million Americans took care of themselves, nobody would have to take care of each other, and we wouldn't have any problems whatsoever. Given that you can't control what other people propose to do to you, I think you need to take affairs, to the extent that you can, into your own hands, which is to say, in particular, people of your generation need to begin to do something they haven't been taught to do, which is save and invest. People need, in particular, to invest in their education. I'm not talking about the education that they might get from New York University or Cal Berkeley, but rather reading the great books, coming to understand Human Action by von Mises, coming to understand the investment process and the savings process. I think it's very important that people begin to become self-aware, and to the extent that they can, self-sufficient, both intellectually and financially. And I think that's becoming critical, frankly, Jake.
So you always talk about von Mises. Let's talk about what are the most important things you learned from that book that pertain to what you just stated, which was self-sufficiency, self-reliance, financial independence, ensuring your own freedom.
What von Mises taught us is that the most honest actions are actions taken in self-interest. Volition, which is what he calls will, and the ability to both utilize and fund your own will, putting yourself to the extent that you can in control of your life, and understanding that what the world owes you, is nothing. Understanding, too, that you get paid, that is, you enjoy material success, and frankly, in my case, psychological success, as a consequence of helping others. You, Jake Ducey, are making more money than you care to admit because you are providing access to information and access to paradigm to 500,000 people. People willingly pay you. They willingly buy things from your advertisers, your sponsors. They willingly pay you for courses because they believe that the money that they send you is well spent, given the return that they receive from using the lessons and the paradigm that you sell them. That is proof, first of all, that you don't need to fulfill a social good because you've already done it. The fact that these people are sending you money, the fact that you are generating more utility, i.e. money, than you're consuming, is proof that you have also done a social good. By investing in yourself, by learning how to impart these messages, and I don't want to make this all about Jake, I just want to use you as an example for your own listeners. By investing in yourself, by investing in your channel at a point in time when you had no money, but you could build your channel, you've put yourself in an enviable position where you are not reliant on anyone other than your own customers. And your own customers will voluntarily sustain your lifestyle because you give them more than they give you, although they're giving you plenty. If you take this example and scale it up to 370 million people, you have a circumstance that I would describe as utopia. What von Mises has said is, if you show me the incentives, I can show you the outcome. Warren Buffett said effectively the same thing. And to the extent that people focus on taking care of their own needs, and they focus on getting ahead both materially and psychologically by taking care of other people's needs for compensation voluntarily, that's the way out of the circumstance.
Powerful. I think, to me, in my journey, which started dropping out of college and all that, everything's brought me back to, you see what's happening in the world and you say, literally, the only thing I can do is create my own self-reliance system. Right. And you said a couple interesting things there. And you were talking about acts in your own self-interest and self-reliance. So then my question then is, to you, then, does saving and wealth building become essentially a moral issue, if that's the word, if you believe that everyone needs to have their own self-reliance, that's the way out of it, you can only take care of yourself? Does saving, does enterprise become an important moral issue?
I think it is a moral issue. But I also think that you need to measure savings, not just materially. I think that goodwill, that is your place in the community, the fact that people know you and love you and trust you, is important. And I think that's a form of savings. I think reputation is non-material savings. I also think that reputation can assist you in material savings. I believe that your own education or self-education is a form of savings. I believe that developing a sense of self is a form of savings, a non-material savings. And I believe that you absolutely have a moral obligation to save. Whether or not it's financially is a different circumstance. It depends on what it is that drives you. I have known some extraordinarily happy and productive people who didn't financially save a farthing. But I would still describe them as highly successful, highly happy human beings. They had great reputations. They had great friendships. They had lives that, while they weren't materially like my life, were certainly sufficient for their needs. And I would describe them in every sense a winner. My fear is that the next 20 years, in terms of the economic climate, will be less benign than the last 40 years. And I'm nervous about people who focus entirely on the non-financial aspect of savings. I'm afraid that their ability to get by materially, given all of the other calls on society's financial mechanisms, will be much less generous than they have in the past, although I certainly hope I'm wrong.
Okay, so what does one do about it? You are, you talk quite a bit about libertarian philosophies, you talk about self-reliance. What are the most important components from this libertarian philosophy or this philosophy of self-reliance that one can implement into their life in order to ensure their own freedom?
A willful life. Think about what's important to you. Think about the fact that nobody owes you anything, and that in order to get the life that's important to you, you are going to have to live that life. Too many people, I think, go through life expecting that whatever is going to happen to them is going to happen to them, and that they don't have any either opportunity or obligation to affect the outcome. And that's wrong. I believe that most people don't read anywhere near enough. And by read, I really mean acquire information and paradigm. If you get it from a video, that's fine with me. If you get it from books on tape, that's fine with me. If you get it from reading, that's fine with me too. And it's fine too if some amount of that reading or some amount of that information absorption is purely for fun. That is as entertainment. But it's important too, I think, that in the course of determining what your volition, what your will is, what you want out of life, and that as you understand that you have an obligation both to yourself and society to act out your own volition, that you equip yourselves with the tools to do that. Doug Casey, who we talk about a lot, is one of the most well-read people I know, and he still reads 2 to 3 hours a day. He's still actively involved in saving information and paradigm through reading and teaching himself on an ongoing basis. So I think a more active life, a more willful life, a more focused life. It doesn't have to be focused on what other people want. It should be focused on what you like, on what you're interested in, is important. I think myself included at some points in time in my life, I've been less inclined than I should have to pay attention to my physical health, which is to say, exercise, diet, doing things like that. Again, being willful. If you want to be healthy, get healthy. Don't expect the, Medicare or Medicaid or, frankly, the medical industry to ensure your health. Be a little better with regards to your diet. Be a lot better with regards to exercise. Take control of this. That's just a form of savings, simply a form of savings. And then certainly financially save. Don't do what governments do. Understand that you have to live well within your means. Understand that nobody else has the obligation to sustain you. And increasingly, society won't have the ability to sustain you even without the obligation. So you're going to have to sustain yourself. I don't want to leave your listeners with the sense that this whole discussion is about finance, that this whole discussion is about materiality. Whatever it is that's important to you, certainly include materiality because you want to be able to feed yourself and your family 10 years from now. But whatever it is that's important to you, be active in terms of getting it. Don't let it just happen to you.
So if someone's looking at what's happening right now in the world and they say, holy cow, and they say, well, what do I need to do? I need to be the next Rick Rule in the commodities boom in the 70s, 80s, and I need to get as rich as possible and ensure as much freedom as I can for myself and my family right now. What do I do? So where does one begin? What are the big mistakes?
For very young people, you begin by savings. Too many people believe that there's happiness in a cup of Starbucks. There's happiness in solvency. So save 10% of your income pre-tax first before you do anything else. Too many people believe there's happiness in status. There isn't. There's status in status. So pay less attention to your image in the eyes of your community and pay more attention to your status in the eyes of yourself. In other words, are you who you want to be? Don't expect to cure your faults in a week. Expect to cure them in a decade. but be actively involved in that process. With regards to materiality, most people don't understand the process of making money. The process of making money is really, really, really simple. You find an activity where you can generate more value for other people than your competitors can. Money, that is savings, is simply the excess of utility generated over utility consumed. If you have a bunch of apples and somebody else has some money and you swap them some apples for some dollars, they gave you the dollars because they wanted the apples more than they wanted the dollars. To the extent that you were able to sell the apples for more than it cost you to grow the apples, you benefited, and the person who bought them from you benefited too. Savings are actually a mark that you have contributed more to society than you have taken from society, because the utility that you generated is more than the utility that you consumed. It's a good thing for society, not a bad thing. And it's a good thing for you too. So a young person needs to begin the process of finding what niche in the market that can be as a business person, it can be as an employee. What function in the market do they enjoy enough? Are they good enough at that they can generate more, in fact, substantially more utility from their efforts than they consume in staying alive? And then they need to save and invest responsibly an important part of the delta between the utility that they generate and the utility that they consume. It really, truly is as simple as that.
So you're such, you're obviously, you're a very eloquent speaker, and it's why people really like you. You communicate effectively, and what you're saying makes a lot of sense, right? But then life happens, and it becomes hard to basically give ourselves a command and follow through on it. How does that occur?
It's precisely because life happens that you have to.
What do you mean?
You need a reserve. It's precisely because your life doesn't go according to plan. It's precisely because although you do everything right, things can go wrong, that requires you to forego consumption now in favor of building reserves, to see yourself through the time when things go wrong. It's easy every day to say, I don't feel good. I would feel better if I went out for beer with my friends. Nothing wrong with beer with your friends, provided that you have saved 10% first. What you do with the excess is your business, not my business or your future's business. But you take the first step, Jake, by taking the first step, by saying to yourself that 10% of all your income, earned income, capital gains income, every other type of income, 10% goes into savings, pre-tax. No ifs, ands, or buts. You want a nice car? Okay, start saving for a nice car. Not out of the 10% that you have set aside for your future. Save a different way for that car. Don't borrow money for lifestyle, to fund lifestyle. Don't borrow money for things that decline in value immediately. There's good debt and bad debt. Kiyosaki talks about this. Borrowing money reasonably to buy a house that you can afford, particularly one where you rent out a part of it to reduce the cost of owning it, where it's almost certain that inflation and scarcity and other things will increase the value of what you bought at the same time that your payment schedule stays fixed with a 30% mortgage. That's good debt. Borrowing $50,000 to buy a car that's worth $6,000 less when you drive it around the block from the car store, the auto dealer, it's insane. Borrowing money to fund something that's declining in value, particularly because you think that a $60,000 car will attract, depending on who you are, a boy or a girl, or sort of admiring looks from people on the street, is the height of idiocy. But as far as I'm concerned, people are absolutely free to be idiots. provided that they have paid themselves first. What people do with the excess is arguably probably not the business of an old, fat, bald guy like me, provided that people have paid themselves first and saved.
You're not totally bald.
Well, listen, I don't want to get in a hair fight with you, Jim.
All right. What's the dumbest investment or financial decision you ever made, just for fun?
Boy. Well, I guess it was a huge one. You may recall from earlier discussions that we've had that I came of age in the decade of the 70s, which was the natural resource decade. And I made the mistake of not understanding in the 70s that markets worked. In other words, that I didn't know that a necessity of markets is that good times would be followed by bad times, that very high commodity prices would increase supply and reduce demand, and you would have a price crash. I believed, rather, the words of the big thinkers, these geniuses like Jeremy Rifkin and Jimmy Carter, all of these, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, all these morons that had this sort of Malthusian doctrine in the 70s. And I believed them. I didn't believe that markets worked. In the early part of the 1980s, when markets did work, I went from being an unalloyed genius to being just plain unalloyed, which is to say, I went from being a very wealthy, hubris-ridden young man to being a somewhat humbler and dead broke young man. The lesson that I learned, of course, is that markets do work, particularly in capital-intensive cyclical businesses like the ones that I prefer. There were subsequent lessons, unfortunately, Jake, all involving hubris. As I began to dig myself out of the hole that I had dug myself into, I believed that my skills as a business person in resources and financial services were translatable into other businesses. And I dabbled around in other businesses, believing that the skill sets that were appropriate to my vocation would be appropriate to my avocation. I learned over time that that wasn't true. And I decided that what I would do, at least professionally and in terms of investments, is I would confine myself to subjects that I had 20 years experience in, where I believed that my experience and my education would allow me to outperform my competitors. Now, as an example, when I'm, well, at age 65, let's just say I'm closer to the end than the beginning, and where I have what are, relative to my needs, a vast amount of surplus capital, I absolutely don't invest outside my skill set. Somebody could pass a really good technology deal by me, and I would say, boy, I'm really delighted to hear about this. It sounds like it's great for mankind. I hope it'll be spectacular for you, but I'm not going to do it because I don't understand it. And if I did understand it, I wouldn't understand it as well as somebody else who was competing with me for it. So it's ironic that as my needs decrease, simultaneously, my willingness to venture outside my circle of competence has decreased. Similarly, although the time that I have to look forward to on Earth is decreasing, that is to say, as I age, I become increasingly patient. When I was a young man, because I wanted to make money, needed to make money, the time frame that I had in mind was 2 months or 3 months or 4 months. I wanted to see tangible, immediate results, which meant that I was frequently disappointed. Now that I have much less time left on Earth, I've become, ironically, much more patient. And I think in 5-year and 6-year and 10-year terms. The consequence of that is that I'm much more often right. There were circumstances where the timeframes I had in mind were insufficient. In other words, the idea that I had was right, sometimes very, very right. But the time frame I had in mind, and therefore the patience I had in mind, and the tolerance for a decline before an advance, didn't allow me the benefit of my own ideas.
Wow, that's powerful. That's what I find myself looking at the commodities. Sometimes I've got that problem. It's I'm expecting a two to 3 months, and then I need to work on that, I guess, huh?
That's been a problem for me for a very long time, Jake. I have a very logical mind. And I think if A is true and B is true and C is true and D is true and E is true, and if the logical outcome of all those things being true is A, as an example. I confuse two words in English. One is inevitable, which means it has to happen. The other is imminent, which means it has to happen quickly. And those are very different words. You can be right over time, but be wrong before then. And you need to have the psychological and financial staying power to be able to play the imminent game, pardon me, the inevitable game, when the imminent game doesn't wear off. Buffett famously teaches a lesson which is subservient to this, which is to say that if you've done the work, but the market doesn't understand the work, don't assume that the market is right and that you're wrong. What Buffett says is that you shouldn't buy a company unless you would be absolutely delighted to see it fall 20 or 30% in price in the month after you bought it. So that you could employ more physical capital behind the intellectual capital that you had already expended. That requires a fairly high degree of competence and confidence. I need to tell you, I've tested that thesis dozens of times in the last 50 years, not always pleasantly. But the truth is, when I look back over the really big gains I've made, the 10 baggers, the 15 baggers, in almost every incident, they took, 5-6 years to take place. And in most cases, I faced a 30 to 50% price decline at some point in time during my holding period before I got my 1,000% gain. Do I wish that wasn't true? Sure. Do my wishes matter? Not at all.
So I've got to ask you, just because that was so good, and then we'll end. So how do you deal with that, right? Because there's, we talk about uranium, we talk about silver. Both of them had great 2020s and 2021 for uranium to start with. But now you're seeing this 30% here drop, 30% here in silver. What do I do, Rick?
I think you orient yourself to understand that investments are like any other consumer good. That the information regarding price is only relevant if you have some opinion as to value. If you believe that amalgamated moose pasture uranium explorations is worth $1 a share and it's selling for $1.50 a share, you probably don't get too aggressive on it. If by contrast, you think it's worth $1 a share and it falls to 50 cents a share, you become extremely aggressive on it within the limits that you have to afford. Do we have enough time for me to tell a story, Jay?
Please.
It might help. In the middle part of my career as a stockbroker, I used to have an office in a shopping center in Carlsbad, California. And we were on one side of the shopping center, and there was a grocery store on the other side of the shopping center. And I tell the parable of tuna fish and stocks. A husband and wife couple enters the shopping center. And this is a traditional couple where she looked after the domestic affairs of the family and the husband looked after the financial affairs. So in the shopping center, she went to the store and he went to the stock brokerage place. One week they came in and she sees a brand of tuna fish in the store and it's selling for $2 a can. And she's familiar with the brand. Her family likes tuna fish. And she thinks that $2 is a fair price to pay for tuna fish. And so she buys herself 6 cans of tuna fish. And he comes into the stock brokerage office and we talk about a mining stock that's selling for $2 a share. And it's a stock that he's heard about, read maybe in Doug Casey or somewhere. He's reasonably familiar with the brand. And he thinks that $2 is a relatively attractive price. And so he buys 1,000 shares of this $2 stock. And both parties, the husband and the wife, go home reasonably satisfied and happy. They come back 2 weeks later, she going to the store, and the same brand of tuna fish, because it's been selling well, is now for sale for $4 a can. They've doubled the price of the tuna fish, although there's no more tuna fish in the can. It's the same brand, everything like that. And she's furious. After giving the store manager a piece of her mind for profiteering, she substitutes canned chicken for tuna fish. The husband, meanwhile, comes to the stock brokerage firm and sees that the stock, while there's no change in the underlying value, is now $4 a share. And he's delighted. He is absolutely elated. This has validated the reason he bought it to begin with. And he buys another 1,000 shares at $4 a share, although arguably it's half as attractive. He goes home elated, and she goes home furious. 2 weeks later, they come back, repeat the process. She goes to the store, and many other housewives reasonably have boycotted this $4 tuna fish. And the store is lousy with tuna fish. And they've marked it down to $1 a can because they couldn't move it in the face of the boycott. And she is elated. She buys so much tuna fish that her car is riding low in the trunk. She stocked up on this $1 tuna fish. The husband has gone to the stockbrokers and seen that the $2 stock that became the $4 stock is now a $1 stock. Although there's no change in the value, there's a change in price. And he's disgusted and sells all his stock. If the husband learned to buy stock the way the wife buys tuna fish, they could both be eating caviar.
That's a good story. So where can I find Amalgamated Moose Pasture Uranium Company?
On the rankings database.
All right. So for everyone listening, Rick, give us where you could find you.
As always, Jake, I love interacting with your audience, and the easiest way to interact with them is to talk about their own portfolios. Any of your listeners who go to the website, which I believe you have below, Rick at ruleinvestmentmedia.com, can enter their natural resource portfolio, and I personally will rank them 1 to 10 and comment on individual issues like Amalgamated Moose Pasture, where I think my comments might have value, and I look forward to doing that. Please be patient, by the way. I'm about 180 rankings behind.
So for everyone listening, we'll put the link to that in the description right there down below. Give us a comment that says Rick Rule Rules right there down below. Comment down Rick Rule Rules. Make sure you hit the like button on this side right over there or that side. Subscribe and bell notification to get notified for new videos. And thank you for coming on, Rick.
Always a pleasure, Jake. Thank you.